So let's get into the spinal cord. Let's look at the spinal cord. And so if we look at the spinal cord from the side, there are 30 segments, vertebral segments. And the spinal cord sends nerves out in between each one. So we sort of divide the spinal cord up into the 30 different sections: 7 cervical, thoracic, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and 5 sacral. Plus or minus 1 or 2. Some people will actually have fused ones up here. And I think that this number is pretty universal across mammals. So even giraffes will have roughly the same anatomy as we do, even though it's on a completely different scale. The nerves that exit out really innervate one whole section of your body. So each one is called a dermatome. So each one of these nerves coming from the cervical cord, cervical levels innervate these parts of your body, and then thoracic those, and lumbar and sacral. And so the sensitivity at each one of these is actually different, and you can see the ones where, like on the stomach and back, this is where under certain rituals for becoming a man in some countries, they would put the hooks through your back and swing you around. And that's because there's not a lot of nerves in your back. I mean, it looks extraordinarily painful, and it's certainly more manly than I am, but it's not as painful as you might think of, especially if you put it through other parts of your body. So this is what we did, is the 2-point, this sort of shows how things like the lip, the thumb, and the index finger, you have millimeter resolution, whereas the forearm, the back, the calf, and the sole have on the order of inch to 2-inch resolution of being able to distinguish two things touching you. Some diseases which cause, like shingles is a disease which gets in, it's a virus that gets into your nervous system and then occasionally expresses itself later on. And the shingles, it turns out, because it's in the nervous system, really only expresses itself on a single dermatome. So here's a picture of shingles, and you can see this bright red here is a single dermatome, which is being, the skin above it is expressing that infection, whereas everything else, the dermatome above and below, is really almost completely normal. Victor Barocas came and I were talking 2 years back, and he was saying that he had some kind of weird rash, and he thought it might be shingles. And I remembered, shingles only express itself in dermatome. So I asked him if he'd show it to me. So he whips off his shirt, and he, sure enough, had this bright band that just went on the bottom. You could follow it right along this dermatome here. It was just a very nice line right there, and that was, to me, the defining mark that it was probably shingles that he had. In fact, he went to the doctor later that day and was diagnosed with shingles. So, and another very famous neuroscientist died of shingles just a few years ago, which was apparently a really bad way to go. So don't do shingles if you're choosing your ways to die. Here is the representation of all the sensory input onto the brain. So there's what's called the sensory cortex, and if you could measure what part of the brain is activated when you touch a part of your body, you can actually map it out. And it turns out, this mapping, on one part of the brain, you get your intestines and things like that, and then you get up into your face, and then to your arms, and then coming back onto the sagittal, just above the corpus callosum, you can see your foot representation here. So if you were to go stimulate the brain and move along like this, you would actually feel it sort of move up and down. It actually had been seen, this whole map had been figured out over 100 years ago by Jackson, who noticed that there were particular kinds of epilepsies, and that these epilepsies would actually look like it started in one limb and it would just move along and would march across, and by watching to see how it marched across, it literally was starting at some place in the brain here and then spreading, and he could actually figure out the exact organization of the homunculus by watching how this seizure propagated across. So there's lots of tremendous observations people have been doing for hundreds of years, which now are much easier to confirm using fMRIs, where you can directly see the activity of the brain as you move something, or vice versa, stimulate and see something actually move and map it back out. And places that have large sensitive representations take up more cortex. So you see things like the fingers, thumbs, lips, and tongue are quite highly, take up a lot of cortex, whereas your chest and your forearms take up a very small portion of your cortex. So the spinal column is the bones all containing, as well as the nerves. And so you have the spinal cord encased in this bone, and then all of these nerves come out of the spinal column between each vertebrae. And of course, if you have an injured disc like this, the column which is supporting the spinal cord can get kinked, and you get all sorts of weird feelings of shooting pains. And so all these nerves, there are the nerves that are leaving the spinal cord to go innervate, and then you have the nerves that are coming back in to the body, the sensory nerves that are coming back in. So if we look at it, so now we've taken away the bone, and now we're seeing the cross-section here of the spinal cord, and you can see there is white matter. So these are actually all of the nerve bundles going up and down the spinal cord, which is sort of on the outside, and on the inside you have gray matter, which is is all the nerves and a lot of connections at the spinal cord level. And then coming off the spinal cord, you have this is called the dorsal root. So this is the dorsal side, and these are the ventral roots. And the way I like to think of this is the dorsal roots, if you're going to get an injury, it's coming from your back, right? It's not going to come through your intestines and all the way to the back. So it's mostly going to come from the backside. And the first thing it's going to cut is the sensory neurons. And so if I'm going to lose something, so the dorsal roots are the ones taking signals back into the brain, into the spinal cord and up to the brain. And we lose by cutting through the sensory first, and then if you keep cutting, then you eventually lose the ones sending the ventral, which are sending signals out to control the muscles. So we lose our sensory first, and then we lose the actual muscle control. And that's the way I like to think to separate it, dorsal versus the ventral root and their roles. So here's a picture of the spinal cord. We'll bring in one in on Tuesday so you can look at it much more closely. It's encased in a real thick leathery skin called the dura and an arachnoid, and you can see there's coming off the back of it, it's sort of a nice symmetry to the spinal cord, and then you see these sort of bundles. The nerves are all sort of coming off fairly uniformly along it, but then they all bundle to exit out a particular, between a particular spinal vertebral disc. And what's surprising, and you'll see this when you see the actual spinal cord, is that it looks relatively short. And everybody asks, well, is this a child's spinal cord? And it turns out the spinal cord really comes down to maybe about your mid-back, and then all of those nerves just end up going down and through the last, between the last the vertebral discs and exit out. And so it sort of ends very early on, and then it's just a bunch of nerves. And that bundle of nerves down below is called the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. So it looks like a big horsey tail. And then the guys who are actually, you can see that this spinal cord here, all of those nerves go down a bit and then out the spinal cord. So it's sort of, you can actually, if you transect the spinal cord, the exact transection and where you lose functions is not exactly going to be mapped up, because you'll find it projects down below where you would expect. So afferent, so this is all of the signals coming into, this is all of our sensory detection from the proprioception in the muscles, there's special nerves that are inside the muscles. We'll talk about those in a lecture or two that detect things like the length of the muscle, all of those, and all of your pain sensories, there's all the afferent pathways coming in through the dorsal root. And then you have the efferent, which is all the signals going to control all the muscles and cause them to contract. And then the dorsal root and the ventral root you see in the spinal cord. When you get up to the head, we have actually a kind of a different system, and they're called the cranial nerves. And there's 12 cranial nerves, and each one projects and controls very different specific things. And we will go over the cranial nerves in a lecture or two. And they do almost all the exact same things, but controlling like salivary glands, controlling your tongue. So now I'm going to actually go through slices of the spinal cord and sort of look at just the organization of the spinal cord. And so the stains that you're looking at in this image are actually staining for white matter. So it's a little backwards. What is white matter is actually dark, and what's gray matter is actually lighter. And so here, these are white matter, and white matter are all the axons, and all these axons are surrounded in myelin to make them fast. And the myelin is, a fatty cell that wraps around it and speeds up the conduction, and it looks white. So all of these here, right here is a big bundle of axons. This is all bundles of axons. There's actually a little tube of liquid that goes here and liquid surrounding it. So the liquid surrounding is the cerebral spinal fluid, and this tube that goes straight down the spinal cord is called the spinal aqueduct. And that spinal aqueduct goes up, and there's actually holes throughout the brain called ventricles. So this slice is sort of one of the very low in your back slices. So this is a sacrococcygeal slice. And I hopefully we'll get a slide or two so you can see this, but this part of the spinal cord is maybe a centimeter across. So now what I'm going to do is sort of go through different aspects of the spinal cord and how it's organized. So if you look at this gray matter, we break it up into sort of three regions. So you have your spinal aqueduct here, and this is called the periaqueductal gray. So the gray matter right next to the spinal aqueduct. And then you have this spiky thing here. This is called the dorsal horn. Okay, so we're going to have, in here we're going to have so this is the spinal aqueduct. Did I get that right? I'm terrible at spelling. Aqueduct is with an E, right? Aqueduct. My trick is to make my handwriting as sloppy so you can't read it. So, okay, so this is the dorsal horn. H-O-R-N. And so we have this nerve out here, which is the dorsal. This is the dorsal root. And this is the sensory coming in. So this is sensory. And that dorsal root comes in through the dorsal horn, and then we'll go up through, this is what's called the dorsal column. The dorsal column. And then, of course, this is going to be called the ventral horn. And this is what sends stuff out to the ventral. Jeez, my handwriting is especially bad today. Ventral root. And it's probably, you need ventral more than root spelled. Ventral root. And that's the motor commands. And then you have this area here, which is the periaqueductal gray. Periaqueductal gray. Okay. And then this is, we'll call this the lateral horn. Okay, so I think I'm going to try to do is keep ascending pathways up on the right-hand side and descending pathways on the left-hand side so that we can keep some kind of separation of all of this. So the dorsal column is going up to the brain. That's up to the brain. And this area here, and this area here is signals coming down from the brain. And we'll then send signals to modulate neurons that are going out to the sensory. So we'll use a system for naming all of the pathways where the first name will be the origin of the pathway and the second name will be the destination of the pathway. So it's fairly simple. So there's a lot of things that happen here at the level of the spinal cord. So sort of first level of functioning and processing, you have a lot of what are called reflexes. And so your brain doesn't really run these reflexes. They happen at the spinal cord. You can modulate them. You can actually make yourself more excitable to reflexes. So, okay, so this is slightly higher up. So let me go back. Look at this one here. So this is very low down. And presumably most of the nerves that are going down here are going just to control the legs and everything sort of below the waist. Whereas we move up here, what's different about this picture than the previous picture? So there's a lot more white matter. And why do you think there's more white matter? More sensory input. That's right. So the higher we move up, we're going to get more and more nerves coming. When we look at this dorsal column, we actually can break it up into two parts. One is called the cuneate fasciculus, which means thin and graceful fasciculus, and there's the cuneate